Aquinas Academy Summer School, January 2002. Third presentation, David Milliken, tape 1.
I'm very glad to be here today because since last September I've been writing a university course to be delivered first to the New South Wales Police Academy and then to be prepared as a university graduate course on new religious movements, sects and cults. And that's all I've been doing pretty much, and misbehaving myself over Christmas, but my head is just awash. So my problem has been what to leave out. And the other thing that is good is that you people are the first group that I've had a chance to say a lot of this stuff to. So gird your loins. Let me just tell you a little about my involvement so that you can get some feeling for what my background is in this area. I've had a fascination for new religious movements, sects and cults, as I have been reflecting these last couple of months since I was a small boy. My mother reminded me that there was nothing I enjoyed more than, on visits to Melbourne, I was born in Geelong, to go and hear the speakers on the Yarra Bank on Sunday afternoons. And the madder they were, the more intrigued I became. And I used to engage them, apparently, as some witness now. You know, the chaps that have theories about numbers and so forth. And it always struck me then that you understood more about people by looking at them in their extremes. And that to understand the nature of sort of belief, it was interesting to me to look at the lengths to which people would go in the pursuit of some noble ideal which they felt was encompassed in a belief system. And this has led me into all manner of engagements with various groups over the years. I became very involved in a group called Tinker Tailor, which was a cult which operated within the sort of Protestant aristocracy of Sydney for many, many years, for about 30 years. It at one time had 7 prominent doctors, part of it. A number of the families were related by marriage to former Anglican archbishops of Sydney. And it went on and on. It goes on and on. They used to run the Commonweal Club. Does anyone know that place? And they were, yes, you worked there. Well, you would have some stories to tell. Have you read my book? No, anyway. Oh. Never ask a question if you don't know what the answer is. So I also became very involved. I wrote a book about that group. This was a sinless perfectionist group who believed that it is a type of relic of a type of Keswick Christianity that and the holiness movement that came out of the 19th century and was influential in the formation of the Salvation Army and other manifestations. This was the sort of underbelly of Protestant evangelicalism, and the story had been hidden assiduously for many years, and I came across it. I actually got to know the leader, the cult leader himself, and spent months sitting talking with him. Finally allowed me to record the conversations, and one day I knew I had enough to hang him, and I made a couple of programs, and he sued me, and in fact I'm being sued at the moment. In fact, the largest defamation case in the history of New South Wales is on at this moment, with me as the target, as a result of a Four Corners program I did about a group called the Foundation for Humanity's Adulthood, which involves, the leader was Jeremy Griffith, and a prominent person in that group was Tim McCartney-Snape. I made that program, and this is the final consequences, this massive lawsuit that's going on at the moment. I've also acted, as Michael said, as an expert witness in a number of quite prominent cases here in Australia and around the world. And I have, interestingly enough, acted on both sides of the camp. In many cases, for example, I'm acting at this moment as an expert witness in a manslaughter case up on at Port Macquarie, a young couple who had become members of a fundamentalist Sikh group refused medical help for their 2-year-old child, and as a consequence she died. And they've been charged with manslaughter, and I'm acting for the wife. My job is to give some sort of understanding to the courts of the world that she lived in and the extent to which she lost the capacity to act in the best interests for herself and her children. I believe she's guilty of manslaughter, but I'm arguing for diminished responsibility as a result of those factors. So that's a bit of my background. Now we've got the morning, so which is good. I've got a lot to say, as you can see. But I'm also very happy as we get going if some of you would like to raise some questions. I feel quite relaxed about that. In fact, in issues like this, there's normally, in a room this size, I know there will be quite a few of you who can say, I know someone who was caught up in a group, and the various issues that raises. Today, a lot of my time is caught up with counselling people whose family members, or loved ones or friends, have been caught up in various groups. In fact, as I was leaving to drive down here from Canberra yesterday, I was held up by a phone call from a woman who said her 2 daughters had just joined Opus Dei, and did I know that this was a cult? And I said, you have opened up a very complex issue, madam. I said, the irony of it is I'm about to address a Catholic gathering tomorrow, and I'll have to treat this matter with great sensitivity. I can tell you what my response was later, when I'm not being recorded. The first issue is an issue of definition. I want to cut to the chase today and talk pretty much about cults, because that's where the rubber hits the road. That's where the issue, the ethical and cultural issues and religious issues are raised. What is a cult? Let me give you a couple of examples. I spent some time with the Raelians here in Australia. The Raelians are a worldwide movement which follows a Frenchman in his middle 50s called Vaudillon, who was a sports writer. And in the 70s, as he was driving around the south of France, he was stopped by a spaceship. People got out of the spaceship, took him into the spaceship, and when he returned to consciousness, he realised that he'd been set aside to deliver a message from the creators of this world, who are called Elohim, the Hebrew word Elohim, and he is Jewish, by the way, and he believes that this world was created by these entities who are 20,000 years more advanced than we are in terms of computer science and such, and that they are monitoring the affairs of this world, and he is their agent, and they are looking to return and recapture the world, and it is the task of the Raelians to build them an embassy. He wanted to build it in Israel. The Israeli government wasn't too happy. He told him to buzz off. So he wiped the dust of the country off his feet, and they're setting up the embassy in Quebec, in Canada. And I've been there and I've taken film of it. Now, this group believe that we achieve immortality through the agent of our creators. They have the capacity to clone human beings and to use the DNA to reproduce human beings because they're so well advanced. And so all Raelians, before they die, have this section of their head, this bone, part of the bone, taken away and put in bottles and stored for the moment when the Elohim will return to this earth, and they may achieve immortality by being recreated again, depending on whether or not their intelligence is high enough, whether they've been good Raelians, and whether they've assisted in building the embassy. Now, is this a cult? I met a group of people some years ago who believed that they were following a brilliant nuclear physicist in his 40s, working at one of the universities here, who went mad, it seemed, to everyone around him, and developed a group of followers and convinced them that we were under attack from alien forces that were sending electromagnetic radiation through the airways and actually were communicating to us through our clothes, any clothes that had synthetic material. And when I saw them, they were sitting in a house in Strathfield. The house was, they all lived in the area, and this was the safe house, and they'd stripped it bare. And they also were stripped bare. They were naked, sitting around a plain pine table on plain pine furniture with pots on their heads. Now they believed that it all had a rational meaning to it, and they were going about their business, meeting regularly in the house, taking their clothes off, sitting around the table, putting the pots on their head. Is this a cult? Now, at this moment in France, Germany, Spain, and various other countries in Europe at the moment, especially the recently communist countries, there is a quite serious attempt to address the issue of cults within contemporary society using legislation. In Germany, for example, you must declare whether or not you are a Scientologist if you're going to apply for a job in the German public service. There is a question on the public service form now. Are you a Scientologist? Are you a member, or do you agree or support the beliefs of Scientology? And the Scientologists have been fighting tooth and nail, using all of their Hollywood stars, using their own law firms. They own a law firm and spend something in the order of $80 to $100 million a year on legal fees, pursuing their critics, and they pursue them with extraordinary vigour. And they're quite a terrifying organisation if they come after you. So they're in almost like a mortal combat with the German government. Also, a number in France also has moved in a different sort of way, but has begun to require registration of religious organisations, and has named a whole series of organisations which they regard as illegitimate expressions of normal religious belief. And interestingly enough, Opus Dei is on that list. I'm not going to say anything more about this. And the Raelians are on this list, and so are the Jehovah's Witnesses, and so is Youth with a Mission. So is some charismatic churches. It's a fascinating list to read. Now, in 1982, in Australia, Scientology was declared a religion on equal terms with the Catholic Church, the Uniting Church, in a famous High Court judgment in Australia in 1982. Australia was the first country in the world to declare Scientology a religion. So you can see we're in an extraordinarily sort of fuzzy area. So the word cult is used in the most imprecise way, and it's a very damaging word. It's a word that can now get you into a lot of trouble. You can get sued for calling a group a cult. I was involved in a case in Singapore where someone took the Straits Times to task because a group of two large Sikh families all converted to Christianity under the influence of a charismatic church. They all started dressing in white. They all lived in this huge big compound, and a Straits Times reporter turned up and sought the advice of an Australian cult expert who said, "Oh, this sounds like a cult." So she said this, and they were sued for good reason. It's a very pejorative word. It's a word that conjures up all manner of horrors. So I've delineated three fairly broad ways in which the word cult is used. There is a theological definition of cults. There is a definition of cults that uses mind control and brainwashing as its central ingredient. And then there is a sort of sociological definition of cults. The theological definition is one that you'll find quite a lot around Christian literature, where a group that does not agree with the basic tenets of Christianity is regarded as a cult, and that's the way Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, Christian Scientists, they were called cults in the 70s and 80s by people writing about the cults from a Christian point of view. And they were defined as cults because they were seen to be antagonistic to the fundamental tenets of Christianity and were there, in a sense, in opposition to Christianity. Now, that idea of defining groups as cults because of their beliefs and their theology still persists. I would say it's one of the prevailing definitions used by many of the anti-cult groups that flourish on the internet. Campus Crusade, for example, who's one of the biggest Christian youth organisations on campuses around the world, uses this as a definition. And I have a number of quotes from some quite right-wing Catholic groups who employ the same use of the word cult, referring to any group that, say, attacks Orthodox Catholic teaching as being a cult. Now, that's an inadequate way of defining a cult. We cannot proceed down that line for a number of reasons. One, it is inappropriate in a pluralist democratic society to hold any group accountable simply on the basis of their beliefs. This is why I raised the issue of the... thanks, Michael. The issue of the Raelians. I mean, how mad is that belief system? To us. Well, it just sounds crazy. But do you agree that they have a right to be in this world? As a matter of fact, they were being hassled at one stage by the tax department because they claimed that they were a religion. I heard about this and I said, well, under the 1982 definition, I said, if the High Court recognises Scientology as a religion, you are a religion also. In fact, I would like to help you make your case. And I wrote a little brief for them. The tax department got very upset that I was... What are you doing, Milliken? You know, for a group like this, I said, no, there are certain rights. And I think using the theological definition as a way of delineating cults feeds into this sort of paranoia about people who are other than us. The second way of defining, also, let me say that the theological definition does not deal with the complexity of what is happening within the life of a group. A group does not become a cult because of what it believes. It becomes a cult by virtue of certain behaviours that develop over time within certain groups that become aberrant, which we will look at in a minute. Let me turn to the second way of defining groups, cults, by using the mind control or brainwashing model. Now, here's a very good example of it from Jan Groenewald, who is one of the world's active anti-cult campaigners and has one of the most active anti-cult websites in the world that she runs out of Brisbane. She says this, and I'm quoting, "Studies have shown that today's cults use a stronger form of mind control than those of 50 years ago. The advent of new psychological experiments in the 60s and 70s have produced the modern methods of mind control which are far more sophisticated than the behaviour modification techniques and thought reforms developed by the Chinese." And she's referring to the philosophical base of the mind control theory, or the experimental base, if you like, which is what happened to a number of American prisoners of war during the Korean War in the early 1950s. A number of GIs captured by the North Koreans. On their release, looked as though they'd converted to communism and had become advocates of the communist system. This was inconceivable to the American mind at that stage. And what developed then was a series of studies, two in particular, in which the pressures and techniques that were brought to bear on those young men were discovered. And that became the theory of mind control. And the theory is this: it is possible to take a person and put them into a situation, exert a number of pressures on them, and they will lose the capacity to act in their own self-interest. They will become almost zombie-like, and they will do anything, behave in any ways, and behave in ways that are obviously antagonistic to ways in which they behaved prior to that event. So the mind control theory, it defines a cult as a group that practice mind control. So what you do then, to discern whether a group is a cult or not, you look into the group and you look to see whether or not the characteristics of mind control are present within the life of the group. You say, there they are, this is a group using mind control, it is a cult. Because mind control is always destructive. Now I would say that's the prevailing model for a lot of people in the media, in the police services, community services and other places. And it is certainly the prevailing view of the anti-cult movement. Now, you'll need to, that's the ACM. The anti-cult movement is a movement in itself, which I distinguish from the cults. The anti-cult movement is often as bad as the cults themselves. So that's why I talk about the anti-cult movement, which is distinguished by its preoccupation with the mind control theory as an adequate definition for the nature of cults. I don't buy it. I don't believe there is any such thing, and I believe it is a very destructive way of conceiving the life of cults. And I'll tell you why. For a start, let me give you my clinical or pastoral experience in relation to this. The theory is very seductive and promises a lot. When, for example, you may find yourself confronted by someone you thought you knew very well, even if it is one of your own family, and to see them suddenly, sometimes in a matter of days, it can happen. It might happen over weeks or months, but you'll see them turn and start attacking you, attacking your values, attacking everything you believe, and the situation of tension develops and the relationship breaks down. It is a very confronting thing for a family to have to face that. And I deal with families who are in that situation all the time. Some families handle the situation magnificently. Some families really fall apart, and it creates a tension inside, and it can be quite devastating. So it is tempting, you see, to be able to say to a family, we have an explanation. The explanation is, this is not really your son. Your son has been taken out of his mind. He is now no longer acting as he was. And what we've got to do is get him out of that group, undo the damage that was done to his mind, and then he will return to his right mind and you will have your son back. That's what the theory is saying. And that is very persuasive. But what is wrong with the theory is this. One, there is no experimental evidence to support it. As it happens, there were 50 United Service men taken and submitted to these techniques, all except 2 or 3 recanted within a matter of weeks. Their conversions were conversions of survival. And it was like heroin use during the Vietnam War. There was a high incidence of heroin use amongst US servicemen. But most, in fact, the numbers retreated back to the national norm within months of them returning home. So there is no continuing experimental evidence to support this. And it would be unethical to set up the sort of experiments that could investigate this. Secondly, it does not account for the complexity of actually what happens inside cults. I divide people in cults into about three different categories. There is a category of people who have a good life inside cults. They flourish. They come alive. They are invigorated by self-sacrifice. They are people who are ennobled by the pursuit of single-minded goals. They can aspire to leadership within the group. They have an enormous sense of solidarity and togetherness within the group. And these can be extremely invigorating and healing things. And some people flourish. And I've had to face that myself, seeing coming across these people in their dozens and deciding, look, you're actually having a very good time. This is absolutely bad what you believe. But I can't say to that person, there is something wrong with you. Because I can't find anything wrong. And no one has been able to experimentally. Secondly, it treats people as if they are victims. And it spawned the deprogramming movement that still flourishes in certain parts around the world. Because it leads to the belief, if this person is the victim of aberrant psychological controls, then deprogramming says grab them and resubmit them to those, so you break them down so that all those controls are sort of broken away, and you re-victimise the person. And that's what happens. Deprogramming is, in the West particularly, is legally very, very dicey. There was a time when the police cooperated. You could go and grab someone out of a group, take them away to a farmhouse for 3 or 4 days, badger them, keep them up at nights, submit them to a constant stream of invective about the group they're part of, show the inconsistencies of it, have ex-members come in and tell them what, blah, blah. And some of them would suddenly break and say, yes, you're right. But most would not. And then they would be reconfirmed back into the life of the group more than ever, and feed the paranoia within many groups, and accentuate the separation between them and the world, and make the possibility of dialogue between families and those outside even more remote. The other thing I notice in my pastoral work is that people who are counselled according to the brain control model take a long time to recover. They remain angry, and then they flood into the anti-cult movement, many of them, and take out their anger. Because it does not allow them to deal with the complexities of what in fact has happened. They have seen people at their best and at their worst within those cultic environments they get a part of. And some of it was wonderful. Some of it was the most exhilarating and exciting experiences that they would ever have and will ever have. And some of it was the most desperate and terrible stuff that you would expect any human being to survive. I've been in situations where I've seen people submitted to the horrors of some of these groups. I remember watching one character actually crawling out of a room like a crab, almost lost the whole sort of image of humanity about him as a result of sort of the sustained pressure of this group who were forcing him into a confession session. And it was clear to me he had nothing to confess, but finally he did, just utterly broken. So experiencing that has for all ex-cultists enormously significant lessons that they have learned about the nature of themselves, the nature of people. It's why they are such interesting people. Because I believe people are at their best and at their worst in religion. Both things are true sometimes at the same time. People are at their best. For that reason, we cannot praise the church enough for the way it has, for the work it has done for the human spirit. But I also say we cannot criticise the church enough for the way it has caused pain and suffering in people's lives. Because there is no pain, I am convinced of this, there is no pain more intense than the disillusionment of belief. It's worse than divorce. It's worse than death sometimes. That when you have given everything, absolutely every ounce of yourself to something, and then it turns bad before your eyes. It can just take the whole bottom out of a person's life, and it seems to leave the most terrible psychic pain. The mind control model does not even go near that. To say to the person, oh, don't worry, you don't have to worry, that wasn't you. You've got to understand the forces that came to bear on you. That once you understand that, that is where your liberation is. Now, it's not true. The liberation comes from them telling their stories, telling about the good times, telling about the bad times, understanding themselves. What was it about myself that led me into that situation, and so on. So much for the mind control theory. Now, so you might want to take me on some of this. But let me just finish off the sociological definition, and then maybe we could stop and have a bit of discussion and then move on. The sociological definition takes a neutral stance and begins by making no judgment about the moral rights of NRMs, that's new religious movements. That is the academic way of referring to cult sects and everything, NRMs. The barest form of it is this, from Rodney Stark and William Sims Banbridge in A Theory of Religion, New York, 87. A church is a conventional religious organisation. A sect is a deviant religious organisation with traditional beliefs and practices. A cult is a deviant religious organisation with novel beliefs and practices. That's it. Now you notice this is a phenomenological approach which makes no judgments about the value of the groups or their beliefs or their behaviour. It rejects the brainwashing model and the mind control theory and treats the members of all groups as autonomous moral agents. It is a view born in the studies of sociology and emerges from the desire to understand the role of alternative religious groups in contemporary society. The preoccupation of the sociologists of religion as they talk about cults is understanding, and many will go to great lengths to avoid making judgments about the moral being. I know, for example, one of my sort of contemporary cult experts, Gordon Melton, he established a relationship with the leadership of the Shariko group. You know, the ones who put the sarin gas? Now, he, as a result of that, he was able to go into that group and live in that group for quite a long period of time. Now, it raises some extraordinarily complex ethical dilemmas about that. I, for example, spent quite a long time in close contact with the family. Do you remember the family? In 1992, 127 kids were taken from 5 homes in Sydney and Melbourne by community services, DOCS in New South Wales, and the police. This was following 3 months of close surveillance using helicopters, 24-hour surveillance of houses, etc. And the family had been on the run, getting progressively more paranoid. They'd actually approached the Ombudsman in the weeks prior to that saying, "We are being followed. Is there a problem? Can we open up some dialogue? What is the problem?" Their kids were being homeschooled and had passed all with flying colours. I don't know, at homeschooling, in some situations, the kids really flourished. These kids were way above the average and had been endorsed by the education departments in Victoria and New South Wales in the weeks prior to the roads. And at 6 o'clock in the morning, their houses were broken into, and children from the age of 3 to 15 were bundled up. They were told that they were going to the zoo, and they were going on a holiday and that they'd be able to get ice creams and such. They were put into buses and driven off to the tender mercies of community services. I was called while the raids were actually underway by the leaders of the family in Sydney. I had only had brief contact with them many, many years before. But I said, "Why are you calling me?" And they said, "Well, we reckon that you'll be fair." I said, "Well, what's happening?" And they said, "Well, our kids have been taken." I said, "Why?" And they said they will not tell us. They say that we are taking them under custody, protective care. And I said, "Right, I'll tell you what you're facing tomorrow morning. Kids rescued from sex cult. That's the headlines you face tomorrow morning." I said, "They may be true, I don't know." And he said, "No, they're not. And so I said, "I'll call you back in 2 hours." So I had 2 hours to suss this situation out. I got on the phone to people around the world. "What do you know about the family? What's going on? Blah, blah, blah. Where are they now at the moment?" Because they have a very open sexual policy. And there was a period in the 70s when when the barriers between all sexuality within the group were removed as an expression of the gospel, they believed. They believed that there was no evil amongst those who loved the Lord. And the boundaries even between adult and children was removed for a period in certain places. And I will have nothing to do with that. I will go after them if it was the case. But I had heard that there had been a decisive break, and the literature said no more. So this is what I was looking for, the evidence. Finally, about 2 o'clock, I called them back. I said, this story hasn't broken yet. I will break the news story. So I called up the ABC, and it was John Doyle's program, Rampaging Roy Slaven. Yeah. And he was on air in the afternoon, his regular program, and I called the producer. And I said, "Have you heard this?" He said, "There's a big story. What do you know?" I said, "I know everything. I'll be there." So, yes, that's probably exactly what I said, I think. my mother said that my mother had 6 children, and she said once when I was a kid, she grabbed me by the ear like this, you know, and she said, "You, I never worried about. You have a robust self-image." So I was surrounded by about 5 or 6 reporters, all with their notebooks and so forth. I went on the program and I said, a massive mistake has been made in Australia. Docs and CSB and the police have raided the homes of families in an unprecedented removal of children from the care of their parents, from an eccentric, mad Christian group, that they must be returned. This is a massive mistake. And as a result of that, I acted for the family. And I was drawn into the life of the family. They used to come in and out of my house. They used to babysit my daughter, who at that stage was about 9 or 10. Absolute trust. I trusted them completely. And I also got to know their leader, David Berg, who has since died, but I was the first person that he corresponded with outside of the group in about 25 years. A grotesque, sex-obsessed sort of character. Grotesque in the extreme. But the people in the family were the nicest people I have met. Lovely. And I was very happy to defend them. So I suffered as a result of that. A number of people contacted me and said they would never listen to me again. There was a dear nun called me up and was convinced I'd taken sexual favours from the family. That's why I was acting on their behalf. I had stuff piled up on my front door and all manner of things. So as a result of taking a stand in their favour. But I did so on matter of principle. Again, I ended up getting all of their literature. I had one of the few complete collections of the Mo letters, and in that is the most damning material, let me tell you, extraordinary material. And I went through all of it and wrote an account which has been published, and I'm about to write another book about it all. So, did I finish the sociological definition? I didn't. No. Now, well, let's look at that situation. You see how the different perspectives that come to bear on that situation will lead you to different conclusions. The mind-controlled people look at the family, they look at that bizarre behaviour, they look at the isolation from the world, they look at the illogicality of many of their beliefs and so on, and they say, here are people who are mind-controlled. And they are now locked into that antagonistic relationship. The theological definition doesn't get you anywhere, simply to say, oh, they've reinvented the gospel, because they were Christians, these people. They had some strange beliefs, but I reckon Bishop Spong's got some strange beliefs. In fact, he's no longer a Christian, damn it, if he's saying, you know, that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, and we don't need to think that Jesus was God, and so on. That's simply dismantling the gospel. That's not reinterpreting it. And in that sense, I would say these people are closer to the heart of it, for all their eccentricity, than Shelby. On that note, I might stop for a minute. If we'd like to ask a couple of questions, we'll do that for about say 5 minutes or so, and then press on. Yes.
I was wondering about, I saw your program on Jeremy Griffiths, and I mean, it so appalled me that frames that remained in my memory, and I'm sorry that they have. Of course,
Yeah.
Mr. Sturgeon,
Yes.
in the Party State,
Wonderful fellow.
when he came down from Mount Everest, started.
I know.
Called Snowden,
I know.
who must be in an extraordinary state of mania.
You said that. I'm not saying any of these words.
Called
Here.
this man,
You'll be sued.
that was in a state of mania writing verse. How David can you say these people should be allowed to discover they've got these young people
Yes.
up in the mountains swearing at them, telling them
Yes.
to using the swear words as a way of saying
I know.
alongside our own.
Yeah.
Beautiful young people alienated from what is good.
Okay, so now can I just? I'm conscious that people can't hear you. So can I just summarise your question? what you've asked me is in relation to that particular Four Corners program dealing about the Foundation for Humanity's adulthood. This was a group of about 50 young people who were... from the cream of Australia's private schools. Churchy, Geelong Grammar, Cranbrook, Knox, Barker, Wesley. Now these are, and many of them prefects. And they had grouped around a man who says that he is the greatest prophet that has ever lived, and that he has written a book called Beyond the Human Condition, in which he says that he has solved the issue of evil in the world. And and there's been an enormous, around this group, there's been an enormous amount of aggravation and difficulty. And there are families that have been torn apart by it, and that was the essence of the program. And your question is, how is it that such bright young people...
My
question
is, if you say
yes.
Cults should be allowed to exist,
yes.
how can you look on and say this should be allowed to exist when it's doing such obvious damage?
Okay, the question is this: how can I have such a sort of sanguine attitude and say, oh, we've got to let cults go about their business when they are doing such damage? Right, this is a crucial question, absolutely crucial question. So if you go the way of the French, then you begin to legislate. You force the groups to submit all manner of scrutiny and constraint. You have various subtle social sanctions that can come to bear on groups. Now, I would fight to the death to avoid that, because it is not the business of the state to step into the world of religion. So I will err on the side of liberality in this sense than I will on the other, because if we begin to open the door to head off and sort of get after groups that in our mind are doing serious damage to those kids, then they'll be after us next. I mean, if we do our job in society, we will become the enemies of some. I mean, Jesus said that, didn't he? He said, in this world you may have troubles. You know, if they didn't like me, they're going to like you even less. Well, maybe on those occasions when we get our act together as groups in society, that actually happens. And if we have participated in a type of mindset that allows the society to go after groups that it believes are aberrant, then we are doing damage to our society. We are shrinking it. We should be the agents of liberality and openness. I think the best thing you can do with these groups, actually, is to let them be in our midst and then bring the clear light of public scrutiny to bear. I never call these groups cults when I never use ridicule. I mean, you may remember that program. I treat them straight. And I try and treat them with respect, as it happens, and I say that to them: I will treat you with respect. I might go after you, but I won't parody you, I won't try and ridicule you, I will just hold up what you believe. And in that case, it's tremendously powerful when a person like Jeremy Griffith actually gets to stand and achieve his great desire to tell the world what he believes. What happens is the world looks at him and thinks he's crazy. Now, in a sense, so I would rather use those other sanctions, and it's for that reason I'm associated with this course. I'm going to set up an institute for the study of new religious movements, which will gather information and allow this sort of exchange and invite the Jeremy Griffiths of this world to come in and talk about what they believe. They never say no. Yes, that's right.
People living in 30 AD.
Yes.
Or if you were.
Yes.
It's possible, I think, that Jesus was part of a sect.
Yeah. I often, yeah.
And wasn't parent faces of the that you doesn't
Yes.
right?
Well, you know, do you remember that incident in the Gospels where Jesus has begun his ministry and he's begun to heal people, and the rumours are starting to spread? Now I can imagine someone calling me up and saying, "Oh, David, guess what? There's this bloke who's healing people." I go, "Oh, there comes a notebook, yes. Who is he? Right? Yeah. Where is he operating? Who's part of his group? Are there any ex-members?" blah, blah, blah. How much money does he spend? I would be asking those questions, indeed. And in fact, do you not hear a whisper of it when his family, on particular instances, send people? And the impression is that they were going to grab him for his own safety, so his own family. I know there's a disputed verse between Catholics and Protestants that says his brothers and sisters. I'm not going to say any more about that. But I think a reasonable exegesis of that passage says that at that point his family have said, enough is enough. You know, you are now attracting. This is going to lead to bad times. You're going to attract the attention of the Romans. You know, you can do this quietly. You don't have to get out there in the middle of everyone. Hear all this healing business and so on. And I think we see that the beginning of that concern right there. So I accept that. There were a lot of cults around during the first century in Rome. I did a bit of a study of this because I wondered whether or not, because one of the questions I'm asked all the time is, are there more cults today than there have been in the past? The other question is, who joins cults? And the other is, why do they stay? What is the power of the cult leader? I'll talk about that in a minute. Yes. There are three categories of people. The first one are the people who live happily within the group. There are those who will go in and they stay. They become career members. And they make their way up through the system, or they find a level, I have been forced to accept that some people are happy. The second category are people who will go in and come out, and life goes on. They can go into the most sort of terrible groups and come out the other side and say, gee whiz, that was interesting, you know. And even have the odd sort of tremor, they'd like to go back again, you know. And they are, but they don't. They get on with their life. And then there is a group of people who will go into a group. They may come out, they may only be in a matter of days, weeks, months or years. It seems to make no difference. But they come out traumatised, deeply traumatised. And they're the people who feed the cult stories on television and keep me in work. They're the people I see. And talk with and write about and so forth.
Is there an openness and tolerance to a cult? Is there a line or
Yes. Give me an instance. I'm always like.
I don't know, some sort of gross act, like
Yeah.
physical damage.
What about circumcision? That's a serious question. I mean, that's physical abuse, isn't it? I mean, it's invaded. It's done as a matter of a religious belief. Oh well, maybe you could argue otherwise these days. But anyway, I just look. The question is, in an atmosphere of some tolerance towards cults, what is the point at which you draw the line and say the society has a right to come to bear on a group that is causing serious damage? Is that the question? Yes. Well, I think there's two models. The model that's used in Australia is that there is no special legislation or special facility that assists us to make judgments about religious groups. There is the criminal code. And if it is clear that someone is being ripped off, children's rights are being abused, then there are effective measures within Australian society to bring enormous pressure to bear on these groups. And I have done that. That has been... just last year I heard about a character down in Melbourne who I'd known about. And he was a drug addict. He had a group around him. He was beating the kids up and all this sort of stuff. And I finally had an opportunity to sort of get in and talk to him. And so I went down and I contacted Channel 9. I thought this is a seventh. What's the Mike Munro program? That one. I said, this is their sort of program. You know, they'll do a job on this bloke. That's all I wanted to do. really expose him. At the same time, I talk to the police, I talk to community services, and I now come to a type of relationship with them. I say to the local police, do you know anything about this group? And I say, yes, we do. We've got a file on him, but we can't do anything. I'll say, well, I'm about to do a program, and I don't want you to be embarrassed. I don't want people to turn up and say, oh, what are you guys doing? But I don't want you to do anything between now and when the program goes to air, because it'll blow my... So we'll come to some arrangement. But I'll certainly then hand everything over to them and keep them engaged, as I will with community services. But there's not much you can do about an adult person who decides, out of the blue, that they won't believe what they've always believed. They'll give all their money away to a person who goes and buys a yacht with it, blows it, who decides to completely subvert their whole sexual life and decide on the basis of their belief to relinquish all sexual encounters or to have forced marriages and so forth. There's nothing you can do, is there, about that, if a person goes into that voluntarily? Do we have a right to say to them, well, look, we don't like that. You're destroying your whole career. You've just dropped out of university. You know, where's that 20,000? Have you given that to that group? Well, you'll get no more from us. And so on. What can you do? My view is that you must express love towards them and keep the contact there and the door open. Yes. Yeah, and back to you. Did you hear that question? Well, is the computer becoming a cult? And simply because it's so much part of the contemporary life that its cultic aspects get lost? No, that's stretching it too far. I don't want the word cult to be stretched out to the point where it begins to pick up preoccupations and such like that. If you're going to use the word cult, and I still use it because I know no other word to use to distinguish between the new religious movements that have got out of hand, because I agree with you, there is a line beyond which I will not go. And it happens every now and then, but it's because of the activity within the group, and that's the point at which I say, yes, you have now become a cult, and you've got to wear the consequences of that name, because that's who you are. Yes. 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 Well, let me talk about cult leaders. The question is there a core of truth? The answer to that is yes, there is, always. And it is like, see, there is a way of reading the theology of the first 300 years of the Christian church by looking at its confrontation with groups that began to overemphasise or become preoccupied with certain aspects of Christian theology. And the church, if you like, has meandered its way in between the goadings of various sects at its edges, saying, no, Jesus wasn't really man, or he wasn't really God, or that human will participates in salvation and so forth. And some sociologists, you see, will argue that in the broader sense the society is like this, that these extreme groups are the place where society exercises its fears, it's under and a whole set of underlying principles and struggles within it. And that a healthy society will always have these groups within it. They're like fleas on the body of main societies. They'll always be there, nipping away. So, the fleas nip? I don't know. Yes.
My son is now a member of a breakaway Hindu group.
Yes.
And he's now become a missionary.
What's the group? The name
Sahaj Yoga.
I know.
Mother.
The Mataji.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, she sued me as well.
She's suing you?
Yeah.
Oh, is she?
Well, not, that's in the past.
Oh, right.
Sri Mataji.
Yeah.
Sri Mataji believes she's the Holy Spirit.
She's a goddess.
Yes.
Yeah. And she's Christian.
Yes. I've got some good friends in Sahaja Yoga. It's not a desperate.
No. So I have to let him go
Yes.
and pray for him. And
Yes.
it's really,
Excellent.
She's given him everything.
This lady is talking about,
My son, who's a missionary.
yes, her son who joined Sahaja Yoga and progressed through the movement to now actually become a missionary. So now there's a... And from what I can gather, you have decided that you're not going to fight him. You're going to allow him... Yes.
I'm sending him love.
You're sending him love. And
And the Holy Spirit.
Yeah. Do you reckon he has a good life in there?
Yes.
Yeah.
He has a very good life. And he's
Yeah.
educating his sons are going to their school
Yeah.
back in the Himalayas.
I know.
And
There's a sort of tragic aspect to it, but you're right.
I know.
Yes.
I know.
Yeah.
What can I do?
No, you can. I think what you're doing is beautiful. In fact, I wish you'd come and talk to some of the people.
I can't do anything about it except send him love.
No, I think you've done exactly the right thing. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Like the heretics, you know, that came
Yeah,
to
yeah.
the have you found that it's more in, say, Western society or
No.
the fact that they found almost big in China?
Yeah. Yeah. No, every society has. I reckon there was a cult of an Aboriginal dreaming cult. They were called the Belgo Men. I'm very interested. Sometime I'm going to have a look at that because I believe that we're all the same. And if we've got cults, then Aboriginal society was going to have cults. And I think there was a group like this. I'm very interested to see. Apparently they used to go and grab young fellas and take them off and teach them a whole new view of the dreaming. It's not like this. It's like this. Oh, it must have happened. So, yes. Two more questions, and I'm going to press on until 11 o'clock. We'll have a break. No. Or should we have a break now? No, 11. Press on until 11. Yes.
People who stay in the group and are happy in the group.
Yes.
People who go in and out of the group and life goes on.
Yes.
People who go in and come out traumatised.
Yes.
I think this would also apply to the Christian community.
It's true. No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Well, that is true. I mean, you and I could go to maybe 10 or... I could think of... I'm in Sydney, aren't I? Yes, sorry, yes. I could go to 10 churches around Sydney which would have my antennae buzzing in terms of what they are doing in relation to the life of their followers. You see the tendency happen. You see, the thing is, I think all religions have a tendency to veer off into cultic behaviour. But what keeps us on the straight and narrow is the discipline of a wider denomination. Cults need secrecy, they need money, and they need recruits. And recruits means they've got to have some PR. But if they have secrecy, if that's where it happens, and it's the process of a whole lot of small choices that are made over many, many years. And until such time as the cult leader believes everything they are saying. Yes.
How do you define normal?
How do I define normal? Yes.
It's a very profound question.
It is. No, it's an extremely important question, and it's a question that I'll probably answer more by implication than directly, and I'd rather do that. If you feel as though I haven't adequately answered that, ask me at the end, and I'll probably avoid you in a similar way. I want to read you a story. Hold the question, please. This is a story of a person I met, and some of you may even know this lady. She was a Josephite nun, and I met her in a group called the Pod, one of the most ugly and dysfunctional groups I've ever been near. The Pod was a group of about 30 adults and about 12 children who were gathered around a chap called Stuart Walker. And Walker lived in Palm Beach, overlooking Mackerel Bay, a house that I think he was renting for about $1,200 a week, something of that order, and it was being paid for by these people, and he was doing the most appalling things to them, stripping them of their money and their dignity and their respect and so forth. I got to know him quite well, actually, It's one of the characteristics of cult leaders that they are always lonely people. You see, there's something quite seductive about having a person crawl along the floor in front of you in obeisance to your godlike and divine qualities. That's very seductive, exhilarating. But the minute it happens, you despise that person. And you are no longer amongst equals. So cult leaders are intensely lonely. And one of the things that makes them very vulnerable to someone like me is that when I turn up, I don't turn up until such time as I know exactly what they're thinking. I've read all their books, I've seen their tapes, I've talked to ex-members, I have a folder until one day I say, yes, I understand exactly what you're thinking. I don't make a move until that point because I don't like being surprised. And if I know how he thinks, then I understand the way he behaves. So I'm able then to engage cult leaders in conversations they've never had. And they've actually become really attached. And this happened between Stuart Walker and I. In other circumstances, I think we would have been good friends, actually. But his drug intake was this. And I saw it. I counted it during a number of days. So this would be about a 24-hour period. It'd be 3 bottles of wine during that time, which is, but that's fair. 75 mils of Valium. 75, right? Now, a little Valium tablet's what? It's either a 5 or a 10 mil. I mean, if I broke one of those and I would be bleary. He's doing, and that's a single tablet, so he's doing 10 or so Valium tablets a day, plus 16 Mercendal Fort, plus 3 to 5 fairly healthy spliffs. You don't know what a spliff is? Oh, that's a joint, marijuana. So that's that. You see, I was astonished that he wasn't comatose. But he had built up a resistance to it. He was really just keeping himself. He was just keeping the cravings at bay. That was it. But he was in that state all the time, and dominating the lives of these people. He said that he was the reincarnation of Jesus, John the Baptist, the Yogananda, Azolananda, and Albert Einstein. And they believed this. They believed all this. He used to perform mock healings on them, and he used to humiliate them. He's the guy I saw do stuff that he, more than any, I had trouble dealing with, keeping my cool. But so let me just read. This is part of an encounter I had. During this night, I met Claire for the first time. Like the others, she wanted to give me her testimony. She told me that from an early age she was brought up in a fundamentalist Catholic environment. She went to Mass at least once every day with her mother, who showed all the characteristics of fundamentalism. Although her mother had died when Claire was young, she left such an indelible mark that Claire was dominated by the sense that she was called to serve God and become a nun, which she did. But the faith of her mother did not fill Claire with the same degree of consolation. She told me that she had been nervous and filled with panic much of the time she lived within the Josephite order. She lived as a nun within the order for the next 24 years, and she now says that she was never happy. She never found the inner peace which she understood was the prize of religious faith. The longer she stayed with the Josephites, the more difficult it became for her. Her own struggle for personal rest became further complicated by what she saw as the rule of power within the life of the church. She said, Christianity, even at its best, is run from the point of view of power. She told me in great detail about the arthritis and high blood pressure which afflicted her before she'd met Walker. She spoke in horror of the constant medications she took, Valium, Seropax, Tryptanol. Things became so filled with ambiguity and panic on occasions that several times she had simply fled from the order in the hope that she'd be better off on her own. This happened when she was actually running a Catholic girls' school in South Australia. One day she was overcome with panic. She walked off the job and remained away for several weeks. Let me say that Claire is one of those beautiful people when you see her, you know you can trust her. And she was like this. She was in her late 40s, I guess. She'd been in the order for 24 years. And she had arrived to positions of some authority in the order. And she'd become like a slave in this group. No matter how hard she worked and gave herself to the pieties of the order, the sense that she was missing something remained with her. So she decided to work as a missionary, and she thought that losing herself in the service to the poor and oppressed would heal her pain. So she travelled to Peru, threw herself into learning Spanish and preparing for the work. But even here she saw the scandal of the church's role as one of the very agents which had allowed the oppression of the poor, whom she had come to serve. She travelled to New York and took some time to herself. It was there that she decided to leave the order and cease her life as a nun. On her return to Adelaide, she left the order and never went back. Since then, she told me that she's never spoken to anyone in the order again. In the year she left the order, Claire met Walker in Adelaide at the Emmaus Centre. He had been invited, this is a Christian-run centre, he had been invited to conduct some courses on rebirthing. And he was, I understand from people who were part of his classes, he was a supreme exponent of this. He had been invited, yes. That first meeting changed her life utterly. She said, the first time I saw him, I saw the Christ in his eyes. That's all I wanted in the convent. That's all I ever wanted. I felt as though at last I had met the Christ. Later she again said, the first time I looked into his eyes, I realised I was looking at the person I'd been waiting for. He absolutely blew me away. Claire immediately began working to bring Walker to Sydney to lead a further series of classes in the Blue Mountains. It was Claire who arranged for Walker's journey to Sydney. She said, I see the pure essence in Christ in him day in and day out in a way that I cannot even question. I see it through his eyes. He doesn't judge. Everyone else judges endlessly. He tells the truth. It can be very confronting, but the next minute he is our friend. She illustrated what she meant. The other night she said, I did something that was very cruel, something very hurtful to him. I did it unconsciously, but it was very cruel. I told him about it, and he just said, I don't remember what you're talking about. And she stopped and looked at me with tears of amazement in her eyes. He's like that all the time. We talked on several occasions about her former life. I was interested to know how it was possible for her to put her former world of Christianity together with the garbled teachings of Walker. I was interested to know if she attempted to keep in touch with some of the recent writings in theology. She said she kept a couple of her books in her room, and she named two by the formidable Edward Schillebeck. But her interest in such matters was dead. She wanted to return to her testimony about the wonders of Paramahansaji, which was what Walker was calling himself at this time. Coming alive with Paramahansaji. All the things that had been killed within her while she was a nun were now bursting into life. She said proudly that she was working 7 days a week for 50 and 60 hours, and she had never felt more amazing. She said that her sexuality had almost been destroyed while she had been a nun, and now it was coming alive. But this was as far as our conversation could go. Walker was never happy with me talking too long with any of his followers, so he interrupted and began the familiar ritual of questions. Tell him about your blood pressure. She told me the story for the third time. What about your hands? There were days when you couldn't open them. She said, well, that is still something that can happen on certain days. Walker broke in, I haven't quite healed that yet then. Claire hurried to take the blame for this. I can still fall back into old patterns, but I desire to change, and with Paramahansa's guidance and love, it is happening. As she was about to leave later, Walker asked her to go through the questions once more. How has your life changed since you met me? She gave the answer with the same sense of enthusiasm as if she was saying it for the first time. She catalogued the wondrous things which had happened to her. Walker broke in, and you're probably going to get laid soon. Claire's face broke into a huge smile. She threw out her arms, kicked her leg in the air, and she said, now that would be something. Now I just want to read, now there's a gap between that and several days later. I had begun manoeuvring Walker into allowing me to film him and put him on 60 Minutes. Now you would think, what an impossibility. But you see, what is going for me in situations like that is the very hubris of the person themselves. And he said to me at dinner one night, he said, David, the thing I've got to work out is, if I do 60 minutes, he said, how am I going to deal with the people that will be lined up outside my front door? And I was thinking, well, the cops, I said, well, yes, I think it's going to be hard. He believed that he was communicating with whales. And he used to take guidance from whales. And on major decisions in the group, he'd go off and he would sit on a rock, and I filmed him sitting on a rock, calling to whales and coming back saying, one has just spoken to me, I'm going to do this. And so he agreed, but Claire was working in a business that this group had set up in Palm Beach called Twinkle Toes. It's a very active house cleaning business. Do you know of it? Yes? You've heard of it? Yeah, it's a very good company. And people like Claire working in it, she would be absolutely scrupulous. And people in the homes, in some of the rich and famous homes around Palm Beach, fell in love with Claire as she came and went in their houses. And she looked after their children, they trusted their children. They had no idea. They thought, oh, she's part of some weird group, But she's such a beautiful person. One of the people that she was working for was a 60 Minutes producer, whose name shall be nameless. And Claire said, oh, David Milliken's over. He's talking to you people about doing a program. He said, what? Milliken's? What? And he immediately starts putting two together. And he says to her, don't have anything to do with it. He'll do a job on it. And I thought, well, it's a rough thing to do to another guy, getting a program. But he was acting out of self-interest really to preserve Claire. So Claire now has this information to come back to tell Walker. So I was in trouble. Now this is what happened on the night when I now had I brought a 60 Minutes producer into the picture. I introduced him into the picture, and he had to sit with me while we went through hours and hours and hours of this sort of stuff. I arrived at 9 p.m. with Mark Llewellyn, a producer working with 60 Minutes. There was a group of 10 people sitting on the floor while Walker was at the table smoking and drinking. Some of the people in the room were members I had not met. Within minutes of the introduction, Walker called for the children to be brought up. They came up the stairs and sat together on the floor. There was 8 of them. The youngest was Mia, about 4 years old. The oldest, Ellie, 15 years. They sat quietly without attracting attention to themselves. They were prepared to remain like this no matter how long it took or how late it became. Their eyes were constantly on Walker, looking to read the signs of what was being asked of them. I was unsure why they had been assembled, except that I had asked him in previous conversations about the possibility of filming them. Then I realised what was happening. Walker was putting them on show. And he began taking them through the familiar questions. Who do you say that I am? Tell David and Mark about your life before you joined the pod. What is life now that you have met me? And so on. It was a rehearsal for the sake of Llewellyn and I. He was showing us how the children performed. One by one the children were put on the spot. As they stumbled through their questions, their eyes never left Walker's face. They spoke only when they were prompted by him. To Mia, he said, tell David what your father did to you in the shower. She hung her head. She's 4, this kid. And tears welled up in her eyes, but she launched into a clear description of what was now part of her story within the pod. It was something that she had repeated many times before. She said that one day her daddy had asked her to come into the shower and wash his snake. Walker interrupted. And what did I tell you to do? She answers, call the police, Paramahansaji. What did I say I would do if you caught him? Hit him, Paramahansaji. I'd kick him so hard he would not sit down for a month. The group on the floor murmured their approval. Tell David how you feel safe in the pod now. She said timidly, I feel very safe now. On and on he went, drawing the little girl into the dark side of her life before she joined the pod with her mother. With her mother sitting in the room, Mia said that her mother had not loved her. She said that her mother used to chase her around with a wooden spoon. All the while, Walker was prompting and pushing her on. That is, until she began to cry and she lost the capacity to speak. Thus satisfied, Walker turned his attention elsewhere. After the children were dismissed, Walker again raised the issue of my proposal to allow 60 Minutes in to film them. This time he asked them to express their doubts and to tell Mark and I the things that they had been saying to him. This is your chance. I know some of you have problems with this. This is your chance. Tell them. At first there was silence. None of them were sure what was happening. If they got it wrong, they were likely to be humiliated, or their loyalty could be questioned, or later, with us out of the way, they may be submitted to a session with Walker and the group. The silence continued as Walker sat with his head down, saying nothing. It was clear that he was demanding that they speak out their concerns. Slowly, some of the brave ones began to talk. They tentatively opened up the combative style of 60 Minutes. Claire stood and spoke, never taking her eyes off Paramahansaji, and she raised information which had come to her from another 60 Minutes reporter. She said she had heard that 60 Minutes was about to accuse Paramahansaji of drug addiction and being a cult leader. I'm hearing this now for the first time. This seemed to open the door, and others became bolder and bolder. They wanted to know how we would edit it. The tone of the questions came more and more hostile, and I decided in my mind that the project was finished. Then Walker stirred, and the room instantly fell into silence. He had not moved from his original position while they spoke. He was staring at the table in front of him, and he continued in his position while he spoke. His mouth was set in an angry grimace, and his voice was steely. I'm sitting here getting very pissed off. I'm becoming more and more angry. I think you're all cunts. I'm sick of you. I'll not have these two men come into my house and be insulted by you. He paused and looked at them. They were staring at him in wide-eyed dismay and fear. Anne Beltrop had her mouth open and her eyes staring in horror. Claire looked devastated. Her brow was crinkled in concentration, trying to work out what she had done wrong. He went on, the volume of his voice raising. And on the basis of fucking rumour, you insulting them, I think you're all a pack of cunts. He paused and no one said a word. He continued to berate them, calling them a pack of selfish bastards. He said they were afraid of letting him go, that they knew this could be the beginning of his venture into the world, and they were frightened. They'd always believed that there would be a critical mass when the pod would arrive at a point when it would burst forth. As for their arguments that 60 Minutes might try to portray him in an unflattering light, he was not worried. He mocked their cowardice and the capacity of 60 Minutes or anyone in the media to hurt him. He said, they can ask me the hardest questions that they like. I'll throw it right back in their faces. The group began to stir with approval as the image of Paramahansa putting the forces of the media to the sword came into their minds. He said that all he had to do was call up his uncle, Sir Russell Madigan, a man who had hundreds of millions of dollars, and he could have 6 of the top QCs in Australia under 60 Minutes. He went on for 30 minutes, attacking their timidity and selfishness. He thumped the table. He let long silences hang in the air while they sat devastated by his anger. He said that he had sought the mind of God and been told that it was good to proceed. This was a chance that had been handed to him by God, and the group were pathetic, snivelling followers just holding him back. Finally, when he had exhausted his anger, he stopped and he said, I want you to apologise to David for the way you have insulted him in my house. The next 40 minutes were excruciating. One by one, they began to apologise. Claire was the first. She stood and walked to the front of the table, addressing us both. There was a look of desperate pleading in her face. She said, I want to apologise to you both, David and Mark. I'm sorry that I felt and said the things that I did. I can see that what I did was hurtful to you and to Paramahansaji. I'm very sorry for that, and I desire that it should be different. I can see that it was my selfishness that prompted me to do this. I was allowing my desire to keep Paramahansaji to myself that may be suspicious. Now, isn't that sad? Yeah. Now, I just want to read you just another incident from another group that I had an encounter with. I'll just introduce the group now, and I'll read it when we come back after our break. Because I wanted to talk a little about the little pebble. No, murmur. Yes. Yes, down at Nowra. This is a group surrounding a chap called William Cann, who was a clerk in a Wollongong building society, and began having visions of Our Lady, the Blessed Virgin. And he began to haunt the whole Marian movement and go to many of those places where people are having apparitions. He began to have them on a regular basis, and a group of people began to congregate around him. He set up an order, and he had contacts around the world. At one stage he might have had 3,000 to 5,000 followers. He has large property holdings. He owns a number of mini-marts, a number of other quite reasonable resources, all in his name. I said, "Isn't that a bit of a problem, William?" He said, "Well, someone's got to look after it, David." I thought, "Oh, yes, all right." I was quite taken back by that. I didn't expect this ferocity to come back at me. But William has been getting out of hand. And just as Abraham was brought by God to look at the heavens and be told that his offspring would be as numerable as the stars or the grains of sand on the seashore, so William's offspring would be numerous. And he has been doing his best to bring this about. The Lord has designated that he will have 72 princesses, and a number of the girls within the movement have been designated as his princesses, and already he has been having sex with them. And they've been handed over by their mothers and fathers with great joy at the privilege that they are entering into. And this, he told me, were a series of prophecies, and he told it me on camera. I filmed him saying, he said this will all be achieved with his holy shining thing. So.
David, where has he gone? No, that's part of the cult. We leave that
Okay, I realised during the break there's a couple of things I want to clear up before I get back to my story about William Cam and the little pebble. First thing I'll read, because the brainwashing model is so central to the discussion about cults. It is the central issue. It is what divides the whole discussion of cults into two camps, those who see it as the primary model for understanding cults and those who do not. Essentially, the academic world is not convinced, and it is driven by, as I said, by the ACM, the anti-cult movement. The implications are seen most specifically in the legal area. You may remember that Patty Hearst is back in the news. Well, the case surrounding her involvement with the Symbionese liberation movement was the major legal battle over the issue of mind control. Because you may remember that she was captured. Patty Hearst is the daughter of the fabulously wealthy press baron family, the Hearsts. She was captured by this ragtag group of Bolshevik left revolutionaries, and she disappeared for a number of months and then reappeared on a surveillance video in a bank, holding up a bank. She was subsequently arrested and charged with various offences arising from that, and her defence was that she was a victim of mind control and that her presence in the bank could be explained in terms of mind control and that she had diminished responsibility in that matter. And the debate was on. And both sides brought in their expert witnesses. And that was a crucial turning point because the brainwashing model was thrown out of court and she was found guilty. and I would have been happy to assist in that process. I do not. I don't accept that as an adequate defence. So let me just before we pass on from the subject, I've got 7 brief points as to why the brainwashing model is inadequate in my mind. I've given you some of them, I'll just go through them again. The only research, this is number 1, the only research or scientific investigation on which the theory stands relates to the Korean War prisoners. It is not clear that the model of brainwashing is supported by the facts. 2, if brainwashing is as effective as its proponents would suggest, then we should expect to see a significant number of people being caught into the web of cult life through their recruiting programs, but this is not the case. In broad terms, the membership of cults is insignificant. Very few people join cults, which would tend to mitigate against the theory that mind control is an effective mechanism for capturing people. 3, the theory is untestable. There are no controlled experiments which support the theory, and ethical constraints would make it impossible. 4, the experience of researchers who have spent time inside the life of these groups do not report activities which have the character of brainwashing. There are all manner of informal and formal sanctions which operate against people leaving, but they have the character of powerful persuasion rather than mind control. 5, the model does not account for the complexity of factors which contribute to a person moving into a new religious movement. The mind control model does not encourage an examination of the state of the person's search or their family or the state of the social order and so on. Brainwashing is essentially individualistic. It puts the authority for decision making entirely on the individual, and this is not necessarily the case, especially in the world of religion. The role of the group as an expression of the religious ideal is important. And finally, many years ago, Professor Harvey Cox argued that the idea of mind control is a way of discrediting groups who threaten the social structure of society. This has been the pattern of history, that society invests protest groups, especially those which seem to be attacking the foundations of the social philosophy, with mystic powers of evil, like the evil eye, or witchcraft, and mind control is another version of that. Now, I also just want to read a couple of paragraphs, which is my sort of evaluation of those three models of how to approach cults, and because I've written it down, it might be clearer. The limitations of the theological model are plain. It is against the spirit of pluralist democratic societies to judge groups because of their beliefs. People have a right to believe what they wish. Where the problem arises is in situations where those groups compete with the mainstream religions like Christianity. There is a further problem in that the theological model is essentially a doctrinal approach and does not account for the larger social and personal dimensions. The preoccupation with the theological model is in the protection of truth and not the circumstances of the people who are the members or their interaction with the culture they live in. The mind control problem, model, I've given my reasons why I'm not happy with that. It is my preference to avoid the word cult in public discussion or on the media. The following reasons make the use of the word problematic. There is no precision or agreement on the meaning of the word as it applies to individual groups. A recent report from the FBI says defining a group as a cult generally has much more to do with the way society perceives the group than it does with the characteristics indigenous to the group itself. An enlightened view from the FBI. They're quite good. They're quite good, actually. I'm using 2 of their reports as my source material for my course. And also a report from the Swiss government on the influence of cults in the Swiss armed forces. Referring to a group as a cult is defamatory and in some cases actionable. Using the word cult damages the dignity of people who show every sign of happiness and satisfaction with their lives in these groups. And referring to a group as a cult damages the possibility of interchange and understanding. But I do not wish to dismiss the word altogether, and for this reason I cannot support the sociological model wholeheartedly. There is a need for some mechanism to distinguish between those NRMs which operate within the acceptable norms of society and those who do not. Of the thousands of NRMs which come and go on the pages of history, there are some which become criminal or who pursue policies so inimical to its members it cannot be treated on equal terms with other religions. These I would refer to as cults. All people working in this field struggle with this issue. And for example, I'm quoting from a famous expert called Dr. Michael Langone. Whatever the term's limitation, it points us to in a meaningful direction, and no other term relevant to group psychological manipulation has ever been able to capture and sustain public interest, which is the sine qua non of public education. If, however, we cannot realistically avoid the term, let us at least strive to use it judiciously. And that is my use. Okay, William Camm. Now, William Camm, I stayed down at the Nowra headquarters of the Little Pebble for about 3 weeks. I lived in there. I lived in one of the caravans. There were about 30 caravans, about 6 or 8 houses on this large converted caravan park behind Nowra on the south coast. And I attended daily mass performed by Father Broussard from the Galveston Diocese in Texas. He performed mass beautifully, and he is Camm's mouthpiece, a well-educated American priest, diocesan priest, and he performs mass every day. He hears confession and so forth, and they perform mass. It's a highly conservative movement. I guess you're more familiar with the sort of Marian movement than most, but one of the difficulties of this movement is, I think it is a particular difficulty for the Catholic Church, because what these movements aspire to, and I know the two major ones in Australia, which is the Little Pebble and the Magnificent Meal, the Meal movement. Deborah Gillespie, I've been up there and I've sat and chatted to her, and I've seen her taking her holy fasts and such, and she's more obviously shocking than William is in a sense. But what is difficult about it is that these are essentially orthodox, conservative Catholic movements. There is a hunger within these people who attend this. It is almost like a retreat to peasant Catholicism, where the ambiguities of contemporary life within the Catholic Church have proved so complex to people that they've begun to hunger for an earlier simplicity, where all of the reforms coming out of Vatican II and so forth should be swept away, and the old verities of authority and certainty and a direct revelation coming from heaven, it gives an enormous sense of security. They insist on receiving the host on the tongue. They insist that they engage in hours of adoration of the host, and they are, to all intents and purposes, extremely pious and well-meaning Catholic people. And the people I met down there were like that. I went to dinner several times with a group of women who have formed an order, and they wear the robes and so forth, and they have made some quite serious commitments to live as a community within the Little Pebble movement, and they are delightful people. And any parish priest would love to have these people in their parish. They will work hard, they are totally dedicated, and they happen to believe that every first Wednesday of the month at 12:30 in the afternoon, William Camm has visions, heavenly visions, which are recorded, written down, published on the net, and so forth. And he says that he has a blessing from the Pope, and he has some reason to draw comfort from the attitudes of this present Pope in relation to the role of Mary. Don't forget when he was shot by that fellow in 1982, the first thing the Pope does is go to Fatima, and he prays to the Blessed Virgin and ascribes to her the physical act of diverting the bullet from his heart and thus saving his life. And it's in that speech he uses the famous phrase which has all us Protestants totally freaking out and alert. and he used the term co-redemptrix. And they spent the rest of the time explaining that away, but there it sits. So the little pebble, William Cairn and his offsiders used to haunt the Vatican, and in various ways managed to manoeuvre themselves into positions where they were actually met the Pope. And there was a photograph. And the Pope came, I think what happened was, the Pope came to actually recognise them. There was this delightful, simple group of Australians, all banded around this fellow, because William Cairn's a small, balding, myopic, fat little man. Not what you'd call by any sort of physical appearances to be a sort of charismatic figure. And there he is with this little group of characters around, the most delightful group of people who saw them. And the Pope, I think, came to recognise them over a number of years. And on one occasion, this has now assumed mythology within the group itself. Cairn called out, "Holy Father, it's the little pebble." He stops. He says, "Oh, the little pebble." He turns, he goes up and he puts his hand on his head and says, "Good, good, good, good." And the photographs are there up on the wall. So they feel that they have a direct blessing from the Holy Father. And that the current investigations by Bishop Wilson and such are pointless, because those apparition sites, which are amongst the most popular in the world, take Medjugorje for example, is not approved by the Church. But there's something in the order of 2 million people go there every year. There are plane loads of Australians who hired for no other purpose than to go to Medjugorje. And they believe, so he says, well, if Medjugorje has Our Lady speaking, then why isn't it happening in Nara? Just because the Church has not approved. We have plenty of examples around the world where the Church has got it wrong. And furthermore, if you happen to find someone like this in your diocese as a bishop, and they're even halfway respectable, then your financial worries are over. You know, I mean, the 2 million pilgrims coming into Medjugorje, I guarantee that solved the financial problems of the local diocese. And that in itself can lead you to taking a fairly liberal view of what's happening. But also let me say that, you see, it is a peculiar difficulty. This, I think it is the point at which the Catholic Church maybe is one at its more vulnerable points in relation to cults. There's a whole other area that has to do with very right-wing, almost fascist groups that have an interest in maintaining their links with the Church. But in this area, there is a peculiar vulnerability, because the Church does believe that Mary speaks from heaven. Now, I'm a Protestant, and I don't wish to offend you, but I don't believe Mary is speaking to anyone. So it is not an issue. But for the Catholic Church, the minute you concede that as a possibility, you've now opened the next decision is, well, which ones are the true ones and which ones are not? And that's where the difficulty arises. And do you write off a movement on the basis of the behaviour of its leaders? That's a dangerous thing for a church to do, any of our churches, because that's an argument that turns back on ourselves. So then how do you make the decision without offending a whole group of people? So you need to make the decision on doctrinal grounds where the Church feels safe, and that is the level at which the examination of the little pebble is happening at this moment. Now, what is interesting is, while I was down there, I met a number of Catholic priests and nuns who came through, and I want to read you an encounter with one that I found quite remarkable. So the vision of Mary, which appears in Cam's messages, is dominated by her suffering and pain. Her self-sacrificing love is what stands between humanity and the wrath of God the Father. Mary looks at the world with intense sorrow. I'm giving you a picture of what Mary is like, who emerges, not just through Cam's, because there is a remarkable similarity between Cam, Medjugorje, Knock, Guadalupe, and some of the other apparitions and locutions that are coming through, because they all communicate with each other. There's a circle of about 150 seers who are receiving apparitions, and they all exchange their words, so they all have a type of similarity. Her words are filled with a sense of urgency, prompted by the proximity of the end times. The Blessed Mother grieves for the Church, which she says has been corrupted at the highest level by modernists and Freemasons. Cam not only communicates with Mary, he also has conversations with Joseph and St Francis and St John, various angels, and often has conversations with Jesus himself. Jesus speaks to the little pebble like this: "What else must I do, my sweet children? Have I, my most holy mother, not suffered enough for you? Must I undergo another crucifixion to awaken our children? Is it not enough that I am re-crucified in the Eucharist each moment of your earthly time, as I am bound as a prisoner of love in the tabernacles throughout the world? What have I done to you, my sweet children, to deserve such treatment? The Eternal Father is angry at the human race. His judgment will soon fall upon an unrepentant generation." That is very characteristic of the language that comes through. This constant repetition of the sort of sorrow, anger, and sort of glowering, growing tendency towards some cataclysmic expression of that anger. And Mary stands between us. Mary actually softens the heart of God by her self-sacrificing, almost pathetic denigration of herself and her pleadings for us. What is surprising about Cam's world is the complex relationship it has with the Catholic Church. There is no sense in which it can claim any association or endorsement from the church hierarchy, but there is a trickle of priests who come and go on the property. Cam claims that more than 50 priests are in good standing with the church, are his followers. He said, "There are many more, but they are afraid of their bishops." Some arrive to check him out on behalf of their parishioners. Others are there because they accept that Mary is speaking to the world, and they are open to the possibility that it may be happening through Cam. Others are believers and find no encouragement for their devotion to Mary in their home diocese. One such man was the United States Jesuit priest I met while visiting Cam, Father Norbert Tracy, PhD. He was a gentle, silver-haired man on his way home to the US. He had retired the month before from a long and distinguished career in education in Korea. His last appointment had been director of the English Language Institute at the Sogang University in Seoul. He had completed his PhD at Minnesota State University in academic administration. He was a quiet, sharp-minded man who was passionately interested in learning all he could about Cam. And during one of the lunchtime conversations between Cam, Father Broussard and myself, Father Tracy approached us and asked if he could participate. Cam agreed. Now, these were conversations that I had after lunch over about a week. They used to last for about 2 hours, and I had a notebook, I was taking notes flat out, and Cam was telling me everything, as I've explained to you. He was entirely open about his role with the princesses and the queens within his movement. He just went on about the most outrageous things, about the fact that he would be the central figure running the world, basically, after he'd become Pope and so on. Now, I made a point during this particular... So Father Norbert was now allowed to sit in and just listen. And he sat and listened with rapt attention. And I made a point, largely for his sake, to take Cam into some of the more extreme areas of his belief. Mostly Father Tracy sat in rapt attention, listening eagerly to all that was being said. Occasionally he interjected and provided some Jesuitical precision to Cam and Father Broussard's arguments. And during a break in the conversation, when Broussard and Tracy and Cam had gone away, I was alone with Father Norbert, and I said to him, "Father, there are thousands of people in the world who are reporting apparitions of Mary. Some of them are frauds." He nodded sadly and said, "Yes, I'm afraid that's true." I continued, "Why have you decided that the little pebble is true?" He hunched over, ruffled his brow and thought. When he looked up, he gazed into my eyes with the conviction of a true believer, and he said, humility, his humility. In the moments before, he had heard the following exchange between Cam and myself. I asked Cam, who will be left on the earth after the terrible chastisements? Cam replied, well, most of the world will be killed, but those who survive will be those who know God. And I asked, but how central will your role be? Cam simply said, I will be the ruler of the world. So, a bit like Claire. So, I want to address that issue of who joins. Who joins these cults. Now, the popular wisdom is that the people who join these groups are weak and easily led, or people who are suffering some sort of trauma. Well, as it happens, the opposite is the case. The people who join cults are strong people. They are usually better educated than the norm. The incident, I have a graph here of the incidence of tertiary education in major cults in the US. And the incidence of tertiary education in cult members puts them about 40% above the society's norm. So they are better educated. They are always middle class. Cults are not a function of the poor or the very rich. There's some basic sort of, now I'm generalising, but generally this is the fact. It is a middle class phenomenon. And from educated families. It is also true that people who join cults tend to be imaginative, creative people. They tend to be people who are prepared to make sacrifices in the pursuit of some noble ideal. Now, a weak person, an easily led person is not like that. You've got to be a bold person. You've got to take risks. You've got to be prepared to step out of line. You've got to be prepared to take on your family. You've got to be prepared to suffer humiliation, ostracism, and all manner of deprivation. And that takes a certain strength. This is the sort of, for about 10 or 12 years, the sociologists interested in new religious movements and cults went into a series of investigations around this question. And what was driving that movement in sociology at the time was to look at, it was to try and profile your most sort of vulnerable cult members. So if we could find out who was likely to join a cult, would it be possible then to identify these vulnerable people within our society and perhaps initiate some way of alerting to them what's going on and providing with them with some protection. Now, that movement has exhausted itself because no one has yet been able to come up with a profile of the typical or most vulnerable person in terms of cult membership. Because every time a model would come up, it would dissipate through just myriad examples that opposed it. And so that, for the last few years, there hasn't been any really worthwhile study or publication in that area. But the likes of Professor Eileen Barker from the London School of Economics, who is a sort of world leader in this field, Gordon Melton, who's president of the American Society for the Study of Religion, irreligious movements and so forth, and myself and others, I guess, have been undertaking some informal studies. And the way I have done it is when I encounter a family who have more than one child and one of them goes into one of these groups, I make a point of asking them, why this one? Tell me what was different about this one. And I very assiduously copy the answers down. And what is emerging is this pattern that I'm talking about, and which I have observed and others have observed. People who join cults tend to be, out of a family, it tends to be the one who is the most creative, tends to be the strongest one, the most highly opinionated one, and the one who perhaps has displayed some dissatisfaction with the nature of life itself, and people who have a higher than normal expectation of what life is really meant to be about. If you're happy with your circumstances, you are not going to join a cult. But if you have some irritation in you, where you aspire to, you are troubled by the justice, the issues of justice in this world, or troubled by all manner of difficulties in this world, then a cult offers some of those people a solution to sort of solving the wound, as it were, which is opened by, I think, by the nature of the human condition itself. Well, you know, we're all Christians here, but by the influence of sin, damn it. And so that has been my experience, and it's also why I find my encounters with ex-cultists so interesting. They are such interesting people, because, as I said, they have seen things that you would not believe, and for a person to survive that, if they and most of them do, and are resolved and go on to quite fulfilling lives, but they are such interesting people because of what they have seen. Now let me just talk briefly about the number of people who are in cults. I just want to talk about that for a couple of minutes. Let me read you some quotations of people making estimates of how many cults there are in various places. This is from the Evening Standard from last year. This is in the Evening Standard in London. Cult movements escalated during the 70s, and there are now approximately 1,500 around the world. I don't know where that came from. About 500 cults are now active in Britain, most of them with branches in London, a fertile recruitment ground of lonely, vulnerable young people. The internet too is posing a new threat, with cults putting supposedly rational argument new recruits. This is from Sheriff Larry Dunn, who was a famous, in the US, he was a famous anti-cult campaigner because of, he used to speak at many conferences. He said devil worshippers sacrifice 50,000 humans a year, mainly transients, runaways and babies, conceived solely for the purpose of sacrifice. It's in the US. Another similar statement published in the US. Cults are constantly recruiting youth to expand their numbers. These youths who join them then are corrupted by the manners and practices of the cult. More cults are emerging from society, and their numbers are increasing with youth recruitment before causing more rebellion against the spirit of goodness. This is Rick Ross, another famous anti-cult theorist. The later part of the 20th century has seen a continuous episodic cult nightmare, with one incident after another. In the United States, there are thousands of cults, with total membership numbers of about 2 million. This is from a report presented to the French National Assembly Committee for the Inquiry on Cults, which was adopted by the French Parliament in December 1999. And they name the following groups as cults and their membership within around the world. Universal Alliance, 2,000. Antinomies, 200,000. The Christian Community, that's the break-off from the Steiner group. Can you believe that? I mean, you couldn't meet a more gentle, innocuous group of people. 80,000. Church of Christ Scientist, 480,000. Neo-Pentecostal Church, 7 million. Universal Church of God, 100,000. The Family, 12,000. Krishna, 80,000. Mahakari Sukha Mahakari, 500,000. That's the group that have their headquarters out at Curtin. I know them quite well. TM, 3 million. Moonies, 180,000. Mormons, 8 million. The Grail Movement, 9,000. The Raelian Movement, 20,000. Scientology, 11 million. Now, I think none of those figures are true. This was accepted by the French government. There has been a concerted effort in Europe to raise the whole heat in relation to new religious movements. Some of it comes, I've got to say, some of it is driven by right-wing elements within the mainline churches in Europe. And it has to do with a whole strange mix of historical factors leading from the Second World War, the massive migration of people into the West, and the declining fortunes of the churches, and their fear of, I think, their fear of rivals. So you can see there's extraordinary confusion about the size of groups. I know of no hard figures. I can give you my best estimate for Australia. I've got files at home of about 120 groups that I would say are sort of dicey in Australia. The average membership of those groups would be between 15 and 40. That is the average size of a cult. Very rarely do they break out of that for a whole set of reasons. And so I would say at the very most in Australia there may be something in the order of 6 to 8, 9, at the most 10,000 people who are members of what I would say are cults. And that would, I think in my heart I'd say it's closer to 5,000. So it's not a large number. And yet it creates an extraordinary hysteria around it in relation to these groups. They find it remarkably difficult to recruit. And there is a sort of, and there is a type of cycle in the life of these groups. I've been trying to sort of dissect it in my mind, but I see a series of 3 stages. Most groups stay small, like Stuart Walker's, like the characters sitting around with pots on their heads. You see, the first thing that comes into my mind are the pots in the image. You know, see how virtuous I am. They are small groups, and they find it very difficult to recruit, extremely difficult. And most people, as you would, I guess, you know, yes. Could I? Well, mind you, I had friends of mine. If they got invited to meetings like that, you'd never get them out of the house. And the pots were there to deflect electromagnetic radiation. And so while they were in the safe house, you see, they had to be in that sort of space, and he'd given it a whole sort of intellectual structure, drawing on his Pippin. Aha! Yeah. No, I was happy to. I was happy to, but I was allowed for a brief visit into the house and to leave because I was a contaminated person. But I was given a sort of privileged situation. But I promised, yes, a dispensation. But I promised if it came to that, I would be prepared to take the ultimate sacrifice. The dress. Right. See me later. I'll see what I can do. I've got another group. You might be interested. Yes. So now let me talk in the remaining minutes about how we deal with people who get caught up. And these are some I guess I'm just drawing on my experience in the way we counsel people. It's quite a difficult situation being caught up as a counsellor, because you are often in the situation where it becomes complex in ways that are not easy for classically trained pastoral counsellors to deal with. Because often you are presented with people who have serious criminal grievances. And part of the resolution of the life of a person who's coming out of a cult, or a family who've got something, whose family member is involved, is the need to resolve matters of justice. And so that is a complicating factor. And before you enter into a relationship with someone caught up in these sort of worlds, you've got to resolve in your own mind, how far are you prepared to go down the track with this person to help them, because to help them resolve those issues as well as the psychological issues that they will present with. Now, I've made the decision fairly early on in the piece that there was a point at which I would, in a way, step out of the classical pastoring mould and say, OK, I will now help you. I will now go to bat for you, and we'll do something, and we'll talk through a whole strategy as to what might be done. But I believe you must be prepared to do that, or have some way of handing that information across into a place that can effectively deal with it, and if needs be. The second thing is you have got to resolve in your mind whether or not you are prepared to buy the brainwashing model or not. That will affect the way you treat the person. And I think I've said enough about that so that you can feel the implications of that. In terms of the advice that I give to people who are family members, I have sort of one principle that I say contact is primary. Do whatever is necessary within the limits of your own values to maintain contact. Because the pressure will come on sooner or later, no matter what. If the group is extreme enough, it will push and push and push to create a gap between you and your family member, that it will strive in that direction. And if it doesn't generate the reasons for doing it from this direction, then it will come from another direction, it'll come from another direction, but it is inevitable that pressure will be there to sever the relationship. Because the cult leader, especially if the cult is a small one, will not allow any divided loyalties. And if a cult leader senses that one of her members has got a close relationship with a family or a spouse, something outside, then that will be targeted in various ways. And so you've got to be aware of it. And what is most difficult for many families is to keep that contact going in the face of the type of provocation that is thrown at them. It is very easy, and all too easy in the case of lots of families, to fall into arguments and try and badger the person out of it. And because it is so clear to the family that the daughter or son is involved in a type of madness. It is so clear. And the family normally is right. I heard something click. Oh no, still going. Oh, it's gone back there.
Yeah.
It automatically does.
It automatically does that.
Okay, right. Sorry.
That's all right.
Yes, under enormous provocation, and it's easy, say, for the father to believe that all he's got to do is get his daughter aside just for half a day and talk some bloody sense to her. Can't you see this guy's a dickhead? Can't you see? He's ripping you off. And all of this may be true, but it doesn't help. It doesn't help. And so, it just simply feeds the presuppositions that are being fed into the mind of this chap's daughter, that your family are not going to support you. It's sure enough, it comes back from a visit with Dad, and it'll all be talked about. What happened? Oh, we went after them. Yeah, see, they cannot understand. The things of the spirit are not discerned by worldly people. And there was a lot of arguments to support the need, at least for the short time, while you're developing your faith, just stand aside for a while. We'll nurture that relationship later. Your parents are really not helping. It's really better for them in the long term. And so this will happen. So, the first thing I would say, and if you know anyone who's in this situation, is go to the very limits of your values to step into the world of your loved one. Read the literature. Read it carefully. Read it theologically so that you understand the belief system. Don't just look at it and say, this is all madness, this is ridiculous, I'm not going to look at this is demonic. No, sit down and go through with a pencil and paper and start to put the worldview, the cosmology of the group down on paper. And ask the big questions. What do they think human beings are? What is the nature of salvation? What is the nature of the afterlife? What is and so on. What is the value? What do they see to be the value of work? What is the relation? What is the view of women? And put all these questions down and answer them. And then begin to develop an understanding of the world that this person has stepped into, and if needs be, join them. Go along to the meetings. Now this can be a great difficulty for people because it raises the whole issue. Well, am I now endorsing? Am I now supporting this? Am I showing some sort of support? Yeah. And you've got to be careful because you may find yourself. I've got to be careful in some situations because they will use my presence as a way of endorsing the group. David Milliken was here the other. We have a photograph of him, and so on. and you may find yourself enlisted in that process. It's difficult, but the primary role is the primary thing is the relationship between the family and that person in there. So the family's got to make up their mind. Are they going to go after the group, or are they interested most of all with the family member? I say take that first, deal with the other issues later. But keep that relationship going. Try and avoid on all occasions to argue. You will not talk anyone out of belief. You won't talk anyone into belief. People do not join cults because of the beliefs. In fact, most cult members cannot articulate their beliefs in a really clear and coherent way. People join cults because of what they see. They see people who are united, focused, joyous, and with an extraordinary sense of purpose. And that can be just overwhelming for some people. Then they just, I'm going to be part of that. And they're in. And there is a period where that is confirmed. It's very exhilarating for them. So I would say, do what I've said, information. Be suspicious of the information about the group you find on the ACM, the anti-cult movement web pages. They are the biggest source of information, and it's huge on the net, by the way. There's a massive... The internet has revolutionised the whole cult world. You go to the anti-cult movement to find out information about a group, but be aware of the presuppositions that hide behind that. And then if all else fails, then you can start thinking about putting some pressure on the group. And sometimes that works. Often it works. I've been in situations, for example, where a family has become so distressed about their child's involvement in the group that it was clear something had to be done. And I actually went along to the group leader and had a chat to him. And in this case, we had a couple of beers and chatting away, and I said, now look, you're in a bit of trouble. I said, you know so-and-so's, so-and-so. Oh, yes. I said, well, their family are not going to give up. I'll tell you what they're going to do. They're going to go after you. You'll have the cops on your door, blah, blah, blah. And I said, you've also got me. And I will be relentless. I'll keep at you, and at you, and at you. And about 7 times out of 10, I'll chuck that person out. If they're causing trouble, the group will come first and they chuck them out. Or the pressure comes on them. Enormous pressure comes on that group member to solve that problem. They are held responsible. So you're also making their life hell inside the group, temporarily, while you bring that pressure to bear. But it can have an effect, and because no group likes people looking over their shoulder, watching what they're doing. In fact, that's one of the significant reasons why the family has so significantly changed over the last couple of years, is because of the sustained attention. They got to. I was talking to the family membership who are a really cloistered group. They even hide away from the family members. I met leaders of the family that even family members had never met, been hidden, not from the world, not just from the world, but from the group itself for 25 years, and ran this group. Who said to me, I said, David, it's got to the stage where we're even frightened to talk to ourselves in our rooms. It is as if everything we say finally makes its way outside. And that is the way. Sooner or later, all groups will leak, and you can find out what's going on. I've got 5 minutes, so maybe take some questions up the back there, and then back to you. Yes. The use of drugs in groups. Well, most people think that cults are sort of hotbeds of rampant sexuality and drugs. That is not my experience. Sexuality is usually pushed aside by the sheer pressure of group life, and leaders are highly suspicious of liaisons within the groups themselves. So a relationship established within a cult is a very difficult thing, because you ultimately cannot trust your partner. And people are usually so exhausted, and they have no opportunity of meeting anyone outside. Well, it's not allowed anyway. So the possibilities of sexual liaison within for a cult member are fairly slim, especially if you are at the more menial levels of cult life. And that is also my experience with drugs. I know a number of cult leaders who themselves are drug addicts. Walker was, Sky Melbourne was, David Berg, the leader of the family, he was alcoholic. He admits to it. And I think he was a gross alcoholic. But within the life of the group, no, my experience is not.
Your comment on overstaying.
No. Well, I don't think overstay is a cult at all. I think it's a secretive organisation which by virtue of its desire to be at the heart of the action within the Catholic Church means that it can never ultimately become a cult, because that would destroy its actual goal. Its goal ultimately is to take over the church, or at least to provide such a powerful influence for conservative theological models in the church that it would have that influence. So, wait on, I'll just see if the some others are coming. Yes. A bit. A couple of months ago, I was invited to open the new religious centre at Flinders University in Adelaide, and the two people who organised that function were the Uniting Church minister and also a chaplain who was a witch, appointed by the Vice Chancellor. One of the most remarkably nice women I know. And I was quite sort of startled by this, that a university was appointing a Wiccan chaplain. But I'm also aware that there are different styles of Wicca, and there's good and bad. And I think white and black and so on. And if we can unwind the mythology that surrounds that word, the actual, and I've been to a few covens and I've participated in a few things, and the reality is always more mundane and more sort of bourgeois in a strange way than the stories. And it's my impression that the Wicca movement in Australia is trying to get its act together, and that there are dimensions to the movement which are a legitimate expression of paganist ideas that perhaps have a right to be in our society. I don't like it, but I'm more sanguine than most people about it. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Changing a name? But we do that in the church, don't we? I mean, you don't like that, changing name? Well, it's a way like certain orders. Certain orders within the Catholic Church will mean that people call themselves by a different name. And it's a way of showing your break with the world, presumably. Yes. Yes? William, do you want to know where the term Little Pebble comes from? Well, it's part of an early vision he had from Mary, who on one occasion showed to Cam this vision of Peter, that's St. Peter, who is the rock. And standing beside St. Peter was William Cam, who in a fit of modesty referred to himself as the Little Pebble. Yes.
I have probably 15 questions, but I just ask, how do you survive in staying straight?
Yes.
In dealing
with all that. Do you hear the question? The question was a personal one to me. And there's two from you lot. Yes. Yes. How do I sort of keep my act together in the midst of all this? Well, I've often had people say to me, when I've been about to approach a group, people who have been very fearful for my spiritual well-being, and they've said, "You are going into the devil's territory. There are extraordinary powers in here. You must be very wary." I've had groups of people who've been praying for me while I've made my forays into these groups and so forth. I've never encountered it, except once. I think one night coming back from an all-night session with Peter Walker. It's not Peter, not Stuart Walker. And I said to my wife, I said, I feel as though I've got something all over me, you know. And that didn't last for long. I have a fairly high view of the nature of evil, in the sense that I think I accept the possibility that there is Satan. So I'm not being cavalier, I guess. It's just I have never encountered it, and I have no fear. And I seem to be, it's part of my personality. I can walk away from most of those situations, and I can barely remember what I've just done. I'll head off and do something else. But I've also got to say that I take a certain pleasure from it. This might sound strange. I was on the phone some time ago, and I was talking to one of these guru types. Margarita, my wife, walks past the door. She stops, and in a flash, she knows what I'm doing. She knows. I mean, she could see the look on my face, the whole thing. She was clear. She goes down the hall muttering to herself, "Urban big game hunting, eh?" Well, I thought, damn it, she's right. When it comes to that point, and I think, right, I'm after you. I sort of, I'm warm to the challenge. So I take a certain, perverse joy in it. I mean, so there's something to stew over in terms of my personality. Pardon?
Have you ever had any death threats?
Oh yes. Yes, I've been threatened numerous times, had dead carcasses hung outside my house, and so on. And I've been sued countless times, and and so on. Oh no, that sort of that's when the fun's. I get sort of invigorated by that. I think, right, okay, this is obviously serious. I'm going to see this one through. Okay, well, thank you very much.
David, you're probably in more danger from the questioners here than the cults you've written. I wonder, there was a sort of a marketing thing in me thinking, what kind of PR literature would the Strathfield potheads have? Join this happy group of people with a photograph. It's the bare facts. Amidst all the humour of it, I'm reminded that humour's comedy is the flip side of tragedy. I don't know about you, but I found all this faintly disturbing in a healthy way this morning, and I really appreciate the fact, David, that you are willing to do this work and go into these places, into the minds of these people, and come back and speak with us about it. I found your exposition enriching and very, very clear. I was just jotted down a couple of thoughts there. It seems to me that, and this is why I think I found it a little disturbing, all behaviours are in some way reflective of the humanity that we all share. Or put another way, every other person has something to teach me about myself. So when you're talking about the cults and the behaviours of various people, it's telling me something about myself. And I suspect that there is a whole area there that we need to look into in terms of our attitude to people who are different and weird and bizarre and the rest of it. It seems to me institutionalised Christianity over many generations has focused too much on dogmas and rules and too little on relationships. And we might ask ourselves a question as to why people leave institutionalised Christianity, and it might be inviting us to examine ourselves and think about what it is to be a follower of the way. And when I think of the Gospels, it never crossed my mind before, but listening to David speak this morning, I think Jesus must have encountered these kinds of things. You will recall him saying, by their fruits you shall know them. In other words, how do you discern those who are with us and those who are against us? And he says, if they're not against you, let them be. And if they're casting out devils in my name, that doesn't matter. And then you've got the advice of Gamaliel and the Acts of the Apostles. In other words, let them be. which is a matter of discernment. David, I think this has been something like a cold shower after the last couple of days. It's brought us down to earth in a very wonderful, I think, and a very healthy way to match you with Les Murray and Morag and the poetry and the art of the last 2 days. There's something very realistic, if rough, about the world that you've introduced us to, a very necessary introduction, I dare say, and I really appreciate it and wish you God's blessing in your work. There are a couple of practical points here.